She stood in the middle of the most expensive restaurant in the city, 7 months pregnant, her baby bump barely hidden beneath the soft blue dress she had chosen so carefully that morning. She had spent 40 minutes standing in front of the mirror, turning sideways, trying to look beautiful for a man who had already decided she was invisible. The reservation had been made under his name, of course. Everything in her life had been made under his name for the past 4 years. The house, the cars, the credit cards, even the dog they had adopted together registered in Derek Harmon's name, like she had simply borrowed it. She walked through the restaurant alone because she had arrived 5 minutes early, the way she always did. Punctuality, her mother had always said, was the first sign of a person who respected others. Claire Harmon, still wearing the name like a coat she wasn't sure fit anymore, had always been that kind of woman, the kind who showed up early, the kind who stayed late, the kind who believed that if you loved someone with enough consistency, enough loyalty, enough grace, eventually they would see it. She had been wrong about that. The Motto D smiled at her with the practiced warmth of someone who had been trained to be kind to pregnant women dining alone. He led her to a corner table draped in white linen, set with crystal glasses that caught the candlelight and scattered it across the walls, like tiny stars. Claire sat down slowly, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, and she smiled back at him because she was still, even then, that kind of woman. She ordered sparkling water. She looked at the menu without really reading it. She checked her phone 3 times in the first 10 minutes, not because she expected a message, but because it was something to do with her hands. And then Derek walked in. She saw him before he saw her. She always saw him first. That was something she had noticed years ago and had always thought of as romantic, the way her eyes found him in every crowded room. The way her heart still did something small and warm when he appeared. She had thought that meant love. She understood now that it had simply meant she was always watching, always waiting, always holding her breath. He walked in wearing the charcoal suit she had picked out for his last board presentation. He looked extraordinary in it, tall, broad-shouldered. His dark hair combed back with the kind of effortless precision that made women at other tables glance up from their meals. Derek Harmon was, by any objective measure, a devastatingly handsome man. He was also, as Claire was about to discover in a way she would never fully recover from, a man who had been lying to her face for 11 months. He wasn't alone, Vanessa. Cole walked in beside him, wearing a red dress that cost more than most people's rent. Claire knew, because she had seen the receipt on Derek's credit card statement 3 weeks ago and had told herself it was a client gift. Vanessa was 26, which made her 4 years younger than Claire, and she wore that youth-like armor, her dark hair falling over one shoulder in the kind of effortlessly sexy arrangement that takes 45 minutes to achieve. She was laughing at something Derek said as they crossed the threshold of the restaurant, her hand resting on his forearm with the ease of a woman who had done it 1,000 times before, which, as it turned out, she had. Claire watched her husband guide this woman, his secretary. The woman Claire had personally interviewed and approved 2 years ago. The woman who had sent Claire a sympathy card when Claire's father passed to a table on the other side of the restaurant. Not their table, a different table, a table for 2 tucked into a private alcove, half hidden by an arrangement of tall white orchids. A table that had clearly been reserved with very deliberate forethought. For a moment, Claire didn't breathe. She sat perfectly still, the way animals go still when they sense danger, and she watched her husband pull out a chair for another woman. She watched him sit down across from her and lean forward in the intimate way he used to lean toward Claire in the early years, when they used to stay up until 2 in the morning talking about everything and nothing, when she still believed she was the most important person in his world. She placed her palm flat on her belly. The baby kicked, and something in Claire Harmon cracked open quietly, without drama, the way old foundations crack before a building falls. She did not cry. She did not stand up and cause the kind of scene that would have been entirely justified. She sat there for 3 long minutes, watching them, burning the image into her memory with the cold and deliberate focus of a woman who has suddenly understood that she is going to need evidence. Then she picked up her phone and took a photograph. And that photograph would eventually become the most important thing Claire owned, but we'll get to that. Let's go back to the beginning. Because, to understand how catastrophically Derek Harmon underestimated his wife, you need to understand who Claire was before she became Mrs. Harmon. And you need to understand the document there, the one Derek had drafted with such confidence, the one his lawyer had called ironclad, the one that contained, buried in paragraph 19 subsection 4, a single clause that Derek had completely and utterly forgotten about. That clause was going to cost him everything. Claire Beaumont, that was her name before, grew up in a modest house in a small city where ambition was treated with gentle suspicion. Her mother, Helen, was a fourth-grade teacher who drove a 12-year-old Honda and believed in the kind of quiet, persistent dignity that doesn't make headlines but builds good lives. Her father, Robert, had worked for 30 years as a structural engineer before a heart attack at 61 took him 3 years before he got to see what his daughter would become. What she became. Before Derek Labor was remarkable. Claire graduated top of her class from a state university and then, through a combination of late nights, scholarships, and the kind of relentless competence that some people are simply born with, she earned a full scholarship to one of the country's best law schools. She specialized in intellectual property law, a field that suited her precisely because it required you to understand not just what something was worth today, but what it might become worth in the future. By 27, she was working as an associate at a firm in the city, billing more hours than anyone in her cohort, sleeping 6 hours a night, and eating lunch at her desk while reviewing contracts the size of small novels. She was not glamorous in the way Vanessa was glamorous. She was something more durable than glamorous. She was the kind of woman who understood fine print. She met Derek at a charity gala she had been invited to through a client she hadn't wanted to go. She had briefs to review, but her best friend Simone had physically dragged her into a taxi and told her that if she spent one more Friday night alone in her apartment, she was going to report Claire to some kind of intervention committee. Derek had approached her at the bar. He had done so with the smooth confidence of a man who had never once been rejected, which should have been the first warning sign. He was charming in a way that was almost too precise, like watching someone perform a skill they had practiced for years. But Claire had been 30 years old and lonely in the way that very busy, very successful women sometimes become lonely. And when Derek Harmon looked at her like she was the only person in the room, she felt something give way inside her chest. They dated for 8 months. He was attentive, generous, present in the beginning, always showing up with flowers she hadn't mentioned she liked, always remembering the details of conversations she'd half forgotten, always making her feel like being chosen by him meant something. Her mother had concerns, her friend Simone had concerns. Claire filed those concerns under overprotective and kept moving forward. He proposed at a restaurant, a different restaurant than the one we started in, though the irony of restaurants in Derek Harmon would take on a certain shape in hindsight. The ring was extraordinary. He got down on one knee. People at the surrounding tables applauded. And this is where the story shifts. Because of what happened next, 2 weeks after the engagement, Derek's lawyer, a man named Gerald Spector who wore suits that cost more than some cars and had the warmth of a well-dressed filing cabinet, contacted Claire with a prenuptial agreement. Now Claire was a lawyer. She understood prenuptial agreements the way a carpenter understands wood. She was not insulted by the request. If anything, she respected it as a practical acknowledgement of financial reality. Derek had a company, Harmon Development Group, which he had built over the previous decade into one of the city's most profitable real estate development firms. It was worth, at the time of their engagement, approximately $42 million. What most people didn't know, or Derek certainly didn't fully appreciate, because he had stopped listening carefully the moment Claire started talking about her legal career, was that 3 months before they met, Claire had quietly finalized something of her own. She had left her firm. She had taken her savings, her expertise, and a very specific piece of advice from a mentor she trusted, and she had invested in a small, almost unknown biotechnology startup called Meridian Labs. The investment was modest by Derek's standards, $120,000, nearly every cent of her personal savings. It had seemed, to everyone who knew about it, like a significant gamble. Claire, who had reviewed Meridian's intellectual property portfolio with the careful eyes of someone who understood exactly what those patents were worth, had not thought of it as a gamble at all. But that was information she had not yet shared with Derek when Gerald Spector sent over the prenuptial agreement. She read it on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table of the apartment she had not yet moved out of, a cup of tea going cold beside her. She read every word, all 47 pages, with the attention she brought to every document she had ever been handed in her professional life. And when she reached paragraph 19, subsection 4, she went still. The clause read, in its formal legal language, as follows. In the event that the husband initiates divorce proceedings citing irreconcilable differences, and in the event that such proceedings occur within a period of 7 years from the date of marriage, the wife shall retain her full premarital assets with no claim made upon them by the husband, And furthermore, any business interests or intellectual property holdings registered in the wife's name prior to the date of marriage shall remain entirely and exclusively in her possession, free from any claim, offset, or reduction, regardless of any subsequent increase in value during the marriage. What that meant, in plain language, was this: if Derek ever decided to leave Claire, specifically if he filed for divorce, she kept everything she brought in, and the value of those assets would be protected even if they had grown during the marriage. Gerald Spector had included that clause as a boilerplate protection, intended to work in Derek's favor to make sure Claire couldn't claim a share of Harmon Development Group's value that had accumulated before the marriage. Their logic was self-serving and straightforward. Derek wanted to protect his company, what Gerald had not bothered to do because he had not bothered to investigate Claire's finances with any real diligence was ask what Claire had brought to the marriage in return. The answer was Meridian Labs. Claire signed the prenuptial agreement. She signed it without requesting a single amendment, without raising a single concern, and without once mentioning Meridian Labs. She married Derek Harmon on a Saturday in September in a garden ceremony attended by 200 people, in a dress that had taken 5 months to make, and for 2 years she was happy, or something close enough to happy that she didn't examine the difference too carefully. She stopped practicing law, Derek had suggested, in the careful way that controlling men always suggest things, that it would be better for their life together if she managed the household, managed their social calendar, managed the things that needed managing so that he could focus on the business. She had agreed, and had told herself it was temporary, and had watched 2 years pass the way seasons pass when you're not paying attention. She got pregnant in their 3rd year. It was planned, or rather, it was agreed upon, which is not quite the same thing. Derek had announced at a dinner party in front of their friends that they were going to start trying for a baby, which was the first Claire had heard of a specific timeline, but she had laughed along with everyone else and told herself she wanted this too. She did want it. The baby was real and wanted and loved from the very first moment she saw the test. Whatever else was happening in their marriage, and by then, if she was honest with herself, she could feel the temperature drop in degree by degree. Baby was hers entirely, and she held on to that truth like a lifeline. It was during her 2nd trimester that she first noticed Vanessa, not in an obvious way, not at first. It was more like a collection of small things that didn't quite add up. The way Derek's phone would vibrate and he would take it into another room. The way certain evenings when he said he was working late had a quality to them that felt different from the previous kind of working late. The way he had started saying Vanessa's name slightly too often in casual conversation. The way a man says a name when it has weight in his mouth that he's trying to disguise as lightness. Claire had made note of these things without acting on them. The way she had been trained to make note of things carefully, without tipping her hand, waiting until she had enough information to understand the full picture. She had been 7 months pregnant when the picture clarified itself completely. In the restaurant on a Tuesday evening. With the photograph she took on her phone. Let's pause here, because this is the moment most people expect the story to collapse into tears, and there were tears. We'll get to those. But what happened in Claire Harmon in the minutes and hours after she watched her husband dine intimately with his secretary was not collapse. It was something much colder and much more precise. Paid for her sparkling water. She tipped generously, she always did, and she walked out of the restaurant at a pace that was measured and unhurried. She called a cart. She went home to the house that was registered in Derek's name. She sat down in the study, the room she had converted into her personal space when she had stopped practicing. The room where her law books still lined the walls, because she had refused to pack them away. And she opened her laptop. She opened the prenuptial agreement. She read paragraph 19, subsection 4 again, and then she opened a second document, one she had been updating, quietly and consistently. For the past 14 months it was a spreadsheet. It tracked the value of her shares in Meridian Labs. Let me tell you about Meridian Labs, the startup Claire had invested in before her marriage had spent its first 2 years in a state of quiet, unglamorous research that most investors would have found alarming. Claire had not found it alarming because she had read every patent filing, every research report, every regulatory submission. And she knew with the same certainty that a structural engineer knows which beams are load-bearing that what Meridian was building was going to matter. What they were building was a platform technology for targeted drug delivery, a method of transporting therapeutic compounds directly to specific cells in the body, bypassing the systemic side effects that made so many treatments difficult to tolerate. It was the kind of thing that sounds technical and distant until you understand what it means for cancer patients, for people with autoimmune diseases, for children born with conditions that currently had no good treatment options. In the 18 months after Claire's marriage, Meridian Labs had published 3 landmark research papers, filed 7 additional patents, and attracted the attention of 2 of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. The quiet conversations had become very serious conversations. The serious conversations had become acquisition negotiations. 14 months into monitoring her investment, Claire's spreadsheet showed a number that still made her breath catch when she looked at it. Her $120,000 was now worth, conservatively, $48 million. Less conservatively, the number was closer to 60. She had said nothing to Derek. Not because she was planning revenge, she wasn't. Not then. She had said nothing because she had learned, over 4 years of marriage, that Derek did not respond well to his wife having things he didn't control. She had learned to hold her own quiet things close. She had learned the grammar of survival inside that marriage without ever quite naming it as survival. But now, sitting in the study at 11:30 at night with the prenuptial agreement open on one screen and her Meridian spreadsheet on another, she understood with complete clarity that the man who had drafted that agreement to protect himself had accidentally written a document that protected her instead. If Derek filed for divorce, the prenup was crystal clear. Her premarital assets, including her Meridian shares, remained entirely hers, all growth protected. No offset, no reduction, no claim. And Derek, who had spent 4 years treating Claire as a beautiful, increasingly inconvenient accessory to his life, had no idea. She closed her laptop, she went upstairs. She lay down on her side of the bed. Derek's side was empty, would be empty until past midnight, because he was still at the restaurant with Vanessa, and she put her hand on her belly and spoke quietly to the child inside her. "We're going to be okay," she said. "I promise you, we are going to be more than okay." Derek came home at 12:40. Claire heard him on the stairs, heard the practiced quiet of a man trying not to wake his wife, and she lay still with her eyes closed and her breathing measured, and even, she was very good, by then, at performing sleep. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She could feel him there, a familiar weight in the room, and then he moved away, toward the bathroom, and she listened to the sound of water running and thought about paragraph 19, subsection forward on a week that followed. Claire operated with a calm that people who knew her took for numbness. Her mother, Helen Cowell, called twice a week and heard the flatness in her daughter's voice and asked if everything was all right. Claire said yes, because the truth was not yet ready to be spoken. Her friend Simone, who had, it should be noted, never trusted Derek, came for lunch one afternoon and watched Claire move around the kitchen with the careful precision of a woman keeping herself very tightly under control, and asked the question directly, "Is he cheating on you?" Claire turned from the counter and looked at her best friend and said, "I'm handling it." Simone understood, from the way Claire said it, that she meant exactly that. Meanwhile, Derek was becoming bolder. It was the boldness of a man who has decided, in the quiet arithmetic of his own mind, that he has already made his choice and is simply waiting for the right moment to execute it. He came home later, he traveled more, he brought his phone to bed, he stopped touching Claire in the small, habitual ways that accumulate into a kind of marriage, the hand at the small of her back, the kiss in the kitchen doorway, the unconscious reaching for her hand in the car. He also stopped asking about the baby with any real interest, the appointments she went to alone. The name conversations she tried to start were deflected, delayed, forgotten. The nursery she began to prepare in the small room at the end of the hallway he had walked past without comment a dozen times. It was Claire understood, already living a different life in his mind. She was a problem to be managed, a situation to be resolved. She had become, to Derek Harmon, a logistical inconvenience in the life. He was reordering around a 26-year-old in a red dress. What she did not know was that the reordering had a specific timeline. His business partner, a man named Oliver Crane, who had known Derek since university and who was, beneath his expensive suits, a man with an actual conscience, came to Claire one afternoon 3 weeks after the restaurant. He came without calling ahead. He stood on her doorstep in the afternoon light, looking like a man who had been arguing with himself for quite some time, and had finally arrived at an uncomfortable conclusion. "I need to tell you something," Oliver said. She let him in. She made tea. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and waited. Derek, Oliver told her, had been planning to file for divorce. Not eventually. Soon he had consulted a lawyer. 6 weeks ago, the same Gerald Spector who had drafted the prenuptial agreement, and he had been told, based on that prenup, that a divorce would leave Claire with very little. The house was Derek's, the cars were Derek's. The accounts were joint, but weighted toward Derek's contributions. Gerald had reviewed the prenup and reported back to Derek with the comfortable confidence of a man who had failed to do his homework. "She'll walk away with her personal effects and a reasonable settlement," Gerald had apparently said. "The prenup is extremely favorable to you." Derek had taken this assessment at face value. Why wouldn't he? Gerald was his lawyer. Gerald had drafted the document. Gerald was supposed to know what was in it. There was one more thing, Oliver told her. Something that arrived in the conversation like a stone dropping into still water. The ripples spreading slow and wide and irreversible. Derek wasn't just planning to divorce her, he was planning to have her removed from the house before the baby came, he said, Oliver told her, his voice carrying the weight of a man who couldn't believe what he was relaying. That it would be cleaner to do it while you're still pregnant because you'd have less leverage emotionally. His words. "I want you to..." No, those were his words, not mine. Claire sat with that for a long moment, then she nodded, once, slowly. She thanked Oliver. She showed him to the door. She stood in the hallway of the house that was registered in Derek's name, and she felt something that was not grief and was not anger, but was something harder and quieter than either of those things. Something that had been forming in her, she realized. For a long time she went back to the study. She picked up her phone. She called a lawyer, not Gerald Spector, and not her old firm, but a woman named Diane Marsh, who had been 2 years ahead of Claire at law school and who was now one of the most formidable family law attorneys in the city, a woman known, in the specific circles where these things are known, for being utterly devastating in courtrooms. "I need a consultation," Claire said. Sooner I need it to be completely confidential. "Tomorrow morning," Diane said, 8 o'clock. Claire arrived at Diane's office at 7:55. Diane was already there. She was that kind of lawyer with coffee and a yellow legal pad and the focused, evaluative expression of a woman who was about to listen to something important. Claire laid it out, all of it, the restaurant, Oliver's visit, the Meridian shares, the prenuptial agreement, specifically paragraph 19, subsection 4. She placed the prenup on the desk between them and pointed to the clause with the quiet precision of someone pointing out a hairline fracture in what appears to be a solid wall. Diane read it. She read it a second time. She was, to her credit, very good at keeping her expression neutral. But Claire saw the moment it landed a fractional pause. A slight drawing in of breath, the briefest flicker of something in her eyes that might have been, in a less controlled person, a smile. "What are the Meridian shares worth?" Diane asked. Claire told her this time. Diane did not bother to suppress the look. "Okay," she said. She set down her pen. She leaned back in her chair. "Walk me through the share registration date." Claire had brought the documentation. The original investment agreement, dated 13 months before her wedding day, the share certificate, the time-stamped records of every subsequent communication with Meridian's board. She laid them on the desk in chronological order with the calm, methodical precision of someone who had been a very good lawyer and had never truly stopped being one. Diane looked at each document. She made notes. She asked 3 specific questions, each of which Claire answered without hesitation. And then she said the thing that Claire had been waiting, with great patience, to hear confirmed by someone else. "If he files, you keep all of it. The full current value, he gets nothing. The prenup he signed to protect himself is the document that's going to gut him." Claire nodded. "There's something else," Diane said. "The clause about the adultery." Claire looked at her. Diane pointed to a different section of the prenup one Claire had noticed but had not yet mentioned, because she had been waiting to see if Diane would find it on her own. Paragraph 11, subsection 2, a morality clause, included apparently at the insistence of Derek's own mother, who had been a religious woman with strong opinions about fidelity, and who had made a participation in the wedding's funding conditional upon a clause that said plainly and without much ambiguity that documented evidence of adultery committed by either party constituted a material breach of the prenuptial agreement, rendering it partially void in favor of the wronged party. Of partial voiding in favor of the wronged party meant, and here, Diane's voice carried a precision that made the words land with particular weight, that, in the event of adultery, Claire was not only entitled to her own protected premarital asset, she was entitled to claim a percentage of the marital assets as well. Claire reached into her bag and placed a printed photograph on the desk, Derek and Vanessa, a restaurant table, his hand over hers. his face turned toward her in the intimate angle of a man who was not dining with a colleague. Diane looked at the photograph. "Tell me you have more than one piece of evidence," she said. Claire opened her bag again. She placed a manila folder on the desk. Inside were photographs spanning for weeks taken, Claire explained in a steady voice. During the evenings she had told Derek she was resting, when she had in fact been sitting in a rented car outside certain restaurants, certain hotels, certain locations that appeared on the credit card statements she had the joint account access to review. Inside were printed copies of text message exchanges that Derek had failed to delete from a tablet they shared that he had, for the past several months, stopped using because he had switched to a phone she didn't have access to. But the older messages were there, months of them, building a portrait of an affair that had begun, by Claire's calculation, approximately 3 weeks after she had announced her pregnancy. She had told him she was pregnant on a Sunday morning in April, in bed, with the test in her hand. He had smiled, he had held her, he had told her he was happy. 3 weeks later, he had started sleeping with his secretary. Diane went through the folder carefully and quietly. When she finished, she closed it and placed her hands flat on the desk and said, "Claire, I'm going to need you to trust me completely with this, because if we do this right, we are going to take him apart." "I trust you," Claire said. "The photograph from the restaurant," Diane said. "Do you have the timestamp?" 7:48 p.m., the 14th of last month, Claire said, without looking at her notes. Diane nodded. "One more question. The Meridian acquisition, is it finalized?" "It closes in 22 days, Claire said. Diane picked up her pen. "Then we have a timing window that we need to be very careful about. We need Derek to file before that acquisition closes. Or we need to file on the right day." Claire had already done the calculation. She had run it 3 different ways. She had accounted for the legal processing time, the notification requirements, the potential for contested proceedings. "If we file on the 21st, Claire said, the acquisition will close 4 days later. By the time the first hearing takes place, the shares will have finalized at full value." Diane looked at her with an expression that was equal parts professional respect and genuine admiration. "You already mapped this out," she said. "It wasn't a question. I've been mapping it for a long time," Claire said. "What happened next unfolded over 9 extraordinary days. And if you have ever watched a controlled demolition, the kind where an entire building comes down in a precise, planned sequence while the rest of the block remains untouched, then you have some sense of what it looked like." On a Thursday, 2 days after her meeting with Diane, Claire had a conversation with Derek that she had carefully prepared. She told him, without tears and without accusation, that she thought they had grown apart, that she thought the marriage had run its course, that she wanted to discuss their options. She used the language of sadness and resignation. She made it easy for him. She practically handed him the door and held it open. Derek, who had already been waiting for an opening and who was constitutionally incapable of recognizing when a trap is disguised as an exit, visibly relaxed. Something in his posture shifted the tension of a man who had been waiting to be confronted, and then, he said, in a voice that was too carefully sympathetic, that perhaps she was right, that perhaps they should have an honest conversation about where they were. He called Gerald Spector the next morning. Claire knew this because Oliver Crane, who had by this point firmly planted himself on the right side of history, sent her a text message that said simply, "He called his lawyer this morning. 30-minute call." Claire forwarded the message to Diane. That afternoon, Diane filed papers. Gerald Spector received them on a Friday afternoon and called Derek in a state of controlled agitation. The call lasted 40 minutes. Claire, at home in the study, did not need to hear the contents of the call to know what was happening. She knew because she had written the papers with Diane, line by line, and she knew exactly what was in them, and she knew exactly the moment at which Gerald Spector would reach the part about Meridian Labs. She imagined his face. She allowed herself a small, private moment with that image, and then she put it away and went back to the nursery to hang the mobile she had been saving for the right weekend. The confrontation happened on a Sunday. Derek came home in the middle of the afternoon. She heard his car before the door, heard the particular quality of speed in the way he moved through the foyer, and he found her in the kitchen, standing at the counter, drinking a glass of water with the careful, measured calm of a woman who has been expecting this exact moment. He stood in the kitchen doorway with Gerald's assessment in his hand, a printed summary, annotated with what she could see, from across the room, were a significant number of handwritten question marks. "What is Meridian Labs?" he said. His voice had a quality she had not heard before, something stripped of its usual performance, something underneath the charm and the confidence that she thought, with a strange and distant pity, was probably the real Derek, the one who appeared only when the architecture of control collapsed. She turned to face him. "It's a biotech company," she said. "I invested in it before we were married." Gerald says he started, and then stopped. He was looking at her the way a man looks when he is reassessing something he thought he understood. "Gerald says your shares are worth 48 million, as of last week's valuation," she said. "Closer to 60 by the time the acquisition finalizes." Silence. "The acquisition," he repeated. "Closes in 18 days, she said. He looked at the paper in his hand. He looked at her. She watched him performing the calculation, watched the numbers, rearranging themselves in his mind, watched the moment his face changed as he understood what the prenup he had signed. The document he had considered a perfect protection actually said about assets registered in her name before the marriage. "You knew," he said. "You knew the whole time." "I signed the prenup you gave me," she said. "Every word of it." "The morality clause," he said, and his voice dropped very low. "My mother's clause." Claire said nothing. "You have evidence," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Diane Marsh has evidence," she said. "She filed it on Friday." Another silence. Longer this time. He put the paper down on the counter. He turned away from her. He braced both hands against the kitchen counter and stood there for a long moment. And she watched his shoulders and thought about the version of herself that had loved this man. The version that had stood in front of 200 people in a handmade dress and believed in him completely. She felt something for that version of herself, a quiet, uncomplicated compassion that didn't look anything like weakness. "I was going to do this differently," he said. "I know," she said. "I didn't think, I know," she said again. "You didn't think out anything." He turned to look at her. "I didn't mean he started. You meant exactly what you thought," she said, quietly. "And I hope, when you think about what you meant, you take a good long look at it." She left the house 2 days later, not because she had to, but because she chose to. She moved into a light-filled apartment across the city, one she had signed a lease on the previous week, one she had furnished with careful thought, one that had a small room at the end of the hallway that she had already begun painting the pale yellow of a nursery. She took her law books. She did not take the dog, because the dog adored her and she knew Derek would use it as a lever and she was done being leveraged. She made a note to have Diane address the dog in the proceedings, and Diane, who was thorough, did. The proceedings were not clean. Derek did not go quietly. He hired additional counsel, a second lawyer, a man with a reputation for aggressive discovery tactics, and they spent 6 weeks attempting to challenge the Meridian Investments classification as a premarital asset. They argued that marital resources had been used to manage the investment, that Claire's presence at certain Meridian board meetings during the marriage constituted a mixing of marital and separate assets, that the timeline of the acquisition was suspiciously coincident with the divorce filing. Diane took each argument apart with the methodical patience of a woman who had spent 20 years preparing for exactly this kind of case. The investment was dated, documented, and entirely Claire's. The board meetings, which Claire had attended at her own discretion, traveling at her own expense from a separate account, generated no marital benefit. The timeline of the acquisition was irrelevant to the classification of the asset. Paragraph 19, subsection 4, remained exactly what it was. A perfectly clear statement that premarital assets, and their growth, belonged to Claire. And then there was the morality clause. Derek's additional counsel tried to challenge the evidence. They called the photographs circumstantial. They suggested alternative interpretations of the text messages. They questioned Oliver Crane's testimony because, yes, Oliver testified, sitting in that courtroom with the quiet dignity of a man who had made a decision about who he wanted to be, and was at peace with it. What they could not challenge, what, in the end, demolished every argument they attempted to construct, was a piece of evidence that Claire had not mentioned to anyone except Diane until the day it was introduced. When Diane presented it in the courtroom, there was a stillness in the room that lasted several full seconds. Even the judge, a woman in her early 60s with the unhurried expression of someone who had seen most things, paused. It was a video, 43 seconds long, filmed in the lobby of a hotel, captured by a security camera that had recorded the date and time automatically in the lower left corner of the frame. 14 months earlier, obtained through a legal process of evidence gathering that Claire would not have known how to pursue had she not been. At her core, Still a very good lawyer. In the video, Derek Harmon and Vanessa Cole crossed the lobby of the hotel together. They stopped at the elevator. He pressed the button. She looked up at him. He said something, and she laughed, and then he put his hand on her face in the specific way a man touches a woman he has been intimate with for some time. The date stamp in the lower left corner of the frame read 11 days after Claire had told him she was pregnant. The room was very quiet. Derek's counsel requested a recess. Derek sat at the counsel table with his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and Claire, from the other side of the room, looked at him and felt nothing that surprised her. She felt tired. She felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a truth for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. She felt her daughter kick, as she placed her hand on her belly, and she breathed. The settlement took 11 more weeks to finalize. By then, Meridian Labs had been fully acquired, and the shares Claire had purchased for $120,000 had converted to a cash sum held in an account in her name, a loan of $57,400,000. The prenup's protection of those assets was ironclad. The morality clause, the one Derek's mother had insisted upon, the one Derek had signed without concern because he had not imagined, at the time, that he would be the one to break it, entitled Claire to a 30% share of the marital assets in the event of documented adultery. The marital assets Harmon Development Group, the properties, the investments, at a combined value of $61 million. 30% of $61 million. Diane presented the calculation to Derek's team on a Tuesday morning. The room on the other side of the table was very quiet for a long time. Derek's additional counsel made several more arguments. Diane responded to each of them with the calm, precise, devastating thoroughness that had made her reputation. The final settlement conference lasted for hours. Derek left the table looking like a man who had walked confidently into what he believed was his own architecture and discovered that the walls belonged to someone else. The agreement was signed on a Thursday. By the time the ink dried, Derek Harmon had transferred $18,300,000, 30% of his marital assets, to Claire. In addition to his confirmation that her Meridian holdings remained entirely hers, he walked away from that conference room with approximately half of what he had had the morning he called Gerald Spector to ask about filing for divorce. Harmon Development Group would survive, barely, with significant restructuring and the loss of Oliver Crane as a partner, because Oliver had resigned 2 weeks into the proceedings, but it would survive in a shape Derek did not recognize, reduced and exposed and stripped of the confidence that had always been its primary asset. Gerald Spector, for his part, quietly settled a professional negligence complaint that Claire chose not to pursue with any particular aggression, because she was not, at her core, a vengeful person. She was a thorough one. There's a difference. Claire's daughter was born on a Wednesday morning in early spring, 23 days after the settlement was signed. She was 7 pounds, 4 ounces, and she came into the world making a sound like a declaration. Claire held her in the delivery room with her mother Helen on one side and Simone on the other. 2 women who had always known exactly who Claire was, even when Claire had been too busy to remember, and she looked at her daughter's face, which was small and perfectly formed and already, somehow, entirely itself. She had chosen a name months ago. She had been waiting to say it out loud until it belonged to a real person in her arms. Nora, she said. Her name is Nora. Helen held Claire's hand and cried quietly in the way of mothers who have been afraid for their children and are now, finally, not afraid. Simone took approximately 30 photographs in the first 5 minutes and did not apologize for any of them. Derek did not come to the hospital. He had, through his counsel, acknowledged parental obligations and expressed a desire to be involved in their daughter's life, on terms to be determined through a parenting agreement. Those terms were being worked through by Diane, carefully and in detail. And Claire had made clear that she had no interest in removing him from Nora's life, only in ensuring that Nora's life was protected from the particular architecture of his choices. There were people who asked Claire, in the months that followed, whether she was angry, whether she felt used, whether she regretted the years she had given to a man who had seen her as a convenience. She thought about those questions carefully. She had given for years to a marriage that had not been what she believed it was. She had given up her career, her independence, her assumption of being truly seen. She had sat alone in restaurant booths and attended doctor's appointments and painted nurseries and performed sleep while her husband crept home from another woman's company. She had been lied to, diminished, and then strategically discarded in the most calculated way a person can be discarded, with financial planning and legal counsel and a cold-eyed assessment of what she was worth. And yet, she sat in the living room of her light-filled apartment on a Saturday morning in late spring with Nora in her arms and the sun coming through the windows and her law books on the shelf and her bank account containing more security than she had ever imagined. And she thought, I didn't lose those years. I learned in them. I built in them. I became, in them, someone who knew exactly what she was worth and had the patience and the precision to let that worth speak for itself. She had never lied. She had never manipulated. She had never done anything except read the document she was given, understand what it said, and wait. She had waited because she believed, at some level she couldn't quite articulate, that the truth had a shape, and if you gave it enough time and enough clarity, it would eventually show itself in full. She had been right about that. It was Oliver Crane, who had, by then, started his own development firm and was doing quietly excellent work in affordable housing, which seemed to suit both his talent and his conscience, who told Claire about 6 months after the settlement what had happened to Vanessa. Vanessa had left Derek's company shortly after the proceedings began. Whether she had resigned or been asked to leave depended on who was telling the story, and Claire didn't particularly need the answer to that question. What Oliver told her was that Vanessa had started her own venture, a small consulting practice, and was apparently doing moderately well and living modestly and seemed, by all accounts, to have emerged from the experience with a more sober understanding of how these situations tend to end. Claire had no particular feeling about Vanessa. She had examined her feelings on that subject with the careful honesty she brought to most things, and what she found was not hate, not even real anger. Vanessa was 26 and ambitious, and had made choices inside a situation that another person had created. Claire saved her actual feelings for the person who had made the vows and broken them deliberately and then planned, with calculation, to use a legal document to minimize the cost of that breaking. That person, by all accounts, was not doing particularly well. Derek had lost Oliver. He had lost 2 major development contracts whose principals had read about the settlement in the business press. He had hired Vanessa's replacement, a young man named Marcus who was, sources said, very competent and entirely immune to Derek's particular brand of charm. He was living in a different house, smaller, newer, without the architectural detail that had given the original house the feeling of permanence. He had been seen, periodically, at the kinds of restaurants where he used to be recognized and welcomed, and had found himself a little less recognized, a little less welcomed, and sitting alone more often than he used to. There was one moment, which Oliver relayed to Claire not with any cruelty but simply because he thought she deserved to know, when Derek had said something that Oliver thought would stay with him for the rest of his life. They had run into each other at a mutual friends event, which happened occasionally in a city of this size, where certain circles always overlapped. Derek had had 2 drinks. He was standing slightly apart from a group of people, the way people stand when they have once been the center of every room and are now adjusting to a different orbit. Oliver had said hello. They had exchanged a few minutes of careful conversation, and then Derek had said quietly, looking at something in the middle distance rather than at Oliver's face, "She knew. She knew from the beginning. I never thought to ask what she was bringing." Oliver had said nothing. "I thought she needed me," Dara said. "I thought that was the whole arrangement." And Oliver, who was a kind man but not a dishonest one, had said, "No, you just needed to think so." That was the end of the conversation. Claire, when Oliver told her this, sat quietly for a moment and then said, "Thank you for telling me." And she meant it, not because it gave her satisfaction in the way she might once have expected, but because it closed something, a door, a chapter, a long and wearying question, and allowed her to turn fully toward what was in front of her. What was in front of her was Nora, who was by then 4 months old and had discovered her own hands and found them endlessly fascinating. What was in front of her was Diane Marsh, who had suggested, at their last meeting, that the city desperately needed family law practitioners who had both technical expertise and genuine understanding of what these cases cost the people inside them, and had asked Claire, in the direct and unceremonious way that Diane asked most things, whether she had ever considered returning to practice. What was in front of her was her mother Helen, who came on Sundays and cooked and held Nora and told stories about Claire's father that made Claire feel close to him in a way she hadn't in years. What was in front of her was who had started calling Claire on Wednesday evenings specifically to tell her something ridiculous that had happened during her week, which was her friendship's particular way of saying, "I am here, I am not going anywhere, and I think you deserve to love." What was in front of her, it turned out, was a great deal of good. She returned to practice 8 months later, not to her old firm, but to Diane's, as a partner specializing in family law. She brought with her an understanding of both sides of the table, that most practitioners didn't have the financial precision of an IP lawyer, the lived knowledge of what it cost to be the person who had signed without fully reading, a steady, an unshakable certainty that documents had power and that understanding them was not optional but essential. She worked primarily with women in the early stages of divorce proceedings. She sat across from them in conference rooms and in her office and occasionally in the kind of coffee shops where a woman could cry without attracting too much attention. And she told them the same thing she told every single one, in slightly different words depending on what they needed to hear. Read it. Read all of it. Every page, every clause, every subsection. The details are not a formality. The details are where everything lives. She began, over the years that followed, known in those specific circles where these things are known as the kind of lawyer who found things in documents that other people missed, the kind who asked the questions that felt too technical to ask and then waited for the answer with an attention so complete it made people feel seen. She charged well. She worked hard. She took on, each year, a number of cases pro bono for women who needed her and couldn't afford her, because she had not forgotten what it was to be dependent and afraid. And she thought that particular knowledge was worth something, if she used it right. Nora grew. She was a fierce, clear-eyed, astonishingly opinionated child who arrived at age 2 with strong preferences about her socks, and at age 3 with a habit of asking the kind of questions that made adults pause and look at each other over her head. She had Claire's focus, and, according to Helen, Robert's laugh, she saw her father on alternating weekends and holidays, as the parenting agreement specified, and those visits were civil and consistent, because Claire had insisted on civility and consistency as the floor of every arrangement. Derek, for his part, was trying, imperfectly, fitfully, with the discomfort of a man learning to be someone he hadn't previously bothered to become, but trying. Claire watched this at a careful remove and held the small, honest hope that Nora would have the version of him that was trying, and let the other version, the one who had sat in an alcove of an expensive restaurant and made his calculation, be the story it had already become. There were evenings, particularly in winter when the city was quiet and Nora was asleep, and Claire sat in the living room of her apartment with a glass of wine and her current case file and the companionable silence of someone who has become, over time, very good at being in her own company. There were evenings when she thought about paragraph 19, subsection 4. She thought about the document that had been designed to diminish her and had instead, through the mechanism of its own author's arrogance and inattention, protected her completely. She thought about the $120,000 that had become $57 million. And she thought about the particular logic of seeds planted before anyone is watching, in the quiet and private soil of your own competence, before anyone has decided what you're worth. She thought about the moment in the restaurant, the sparkling water, the white linen, the blue dress, her hand on her belly. She thought about the coldness that had settled through her in that moment and the decision she had made in the 3 minutes before she picked up her phone. She thought, there are things in this world that look like powerlessness that are actually the opposite. If you know how to read the room, if you know how to wait, if you know, with absolute certainty, what the document actually says. She was that kind of woman. She had always been that kind of woman. She just needed one particular man to underestimate her for long enough to prove it. He had given her for years. She had only needed one clause. Some people spend their whole lives chasing power, loudly, grabbing, leveraging, performing strength. And then there is the other kind of person. The kind who sits quietly with a prenup in their hands and a spreadsheet on their screen and a baby in their belly and a patience that cannot be bought or borrowed or intimidated. The kind who knows that the most devastating thing in the world is not fury, it is competence. And time. Derek Harmon forgot one clause. Claire Beaumont never forgot anything.